You know, I once in a while I hit a home run, and this is one of those times.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and we are back together again for another episode in our Biblical Theology project. Today we are planning to talk about Deuteronomy chapters 6 and 7, and I think we've got our regular team here, although we have been experiencing a few technical difficulties. But Micah, it's nice to see you present and smiling. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Got to preach God's word yesterday and baptized a new believer, so it's always a good day when you get to do that.
Yeah, amen. Well, it's good to see you today, and so let's go ahead and bring in Brother Eric. Eric, how you doing?
I'm doing well, and I know I don't ever say this, but these chapters are exceptional. Now, this time I mean it with, I'm saying this with more emphasis. For some reason, some chapters just have a little bit more meat than others. I think these are such chapters, so I'm looking forward to diving in.
Greg's going to call you the boy who cried exceptional.
Yeah, I think I am.
Yeah. Well, Greg, how about you? Are you excited to get into these exceptional chapters?
I am equally as excited as I ever am, which is quite exciting. No, I'm good. I'm great. Everything's good. So.
I thought you were about to lie to all of our faces and say you were equally as excited as Eric.
No,
in which case we were going to have to call you on it right away.
Yeah,
so
that'd be a blatant lie. It's a high-handed sin at that point. And
nobody would believe it. So that's all right. Well, it is good to see you guys, and I am also excited to discuss these chapters with you. If you're watching this and you haven't read those chapters, we'd encourage you to read them just so that you know all of the content that's there, because we won't discuss every single word, but we will discuss the things that stand out most to us. And which of you guys want to get us started with a question from Deuteronomy 6 today?
Yeah, I'll start with a question. My question is simple yet not. And I know there's going to be temptation probably to be thinking in New Testament terms, but so my question is, what does it mean that the Lord is one? That in chapter 6, verse 4, it talks about the Lord being one. So what do you guys think that means?
I think at a minimum, it implies monotheism. There are people who, try not to reference any New Testament texts, there are people who try to take that and say, the Lord is one. This is the basic confession. This is the basic confession of the Old Covenant people of God about his nature. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's the Shema. There are people who want to take that and draw implications about the lack of diversity within the Godhead because of the simple confession that the Lord is one. He's one solitary being. Obviously, and I'm talking about multiple forms of Unitarianism with that. They want to deny the doctrine of the Trinity because of this confession that the Lord is one. I don't think that holds up to the weight of, especially New Testament revelation, but even Old Testament revelation, where God, his word, and his spirit are all have divine characteristics and are all presently working together and doing God things together. So like you can see that even in the creation account, God, his word, and his spirit, all three present there, all doing God things. All having God attributes, yet there is one God. So I think that people take this and they try to draw implications that it's not intending to make. What it's actually teaching is that there is only one God. And more specifically, there is only one God who has bound himself in covenant to his people. Yahweh is his covenant name. Yahweh is one. Therefore, they're going to serve him only.
I think this is a hard thing to talk about because we want to talk about the New Testament and all the things that go in there. Now, I don't have nearly the command of Hebrew that I have of Greek, and even that's not great. But the little bit of research that I did into the Hebrew word that's used there I came up with 5 possible definitions or 5 possible spheres of what that word one could be. The first one is one thing. He is singular, and perhaps, as you said, Micah, at a minimum, it's teaching monotheism, and so I think that definition would fit there well. The second one was he is each and every. I'm not sure that fits. A third was certain, like he certainly is, and so maybe it falls a bit into there. The Lord is. The fourth was only once or once for all, and so maybe that's pointing to he is the only God or he's the eternal God. And then the fifth one was just in first position, which might not work. And so some of those definitions, I'm not convinced that the text is trying to say all of those things. That just because a word has a range of meaning doesn't mean that when you see it, it means all the range that it possibly could. Actually, that's probably not the case. And so if it's not just pointing to the monotheistic, the Lord is one being, one thing. I like the idea of that third definition. The Lord is certain, or the Lord is once for all. He is your God. He is eternal. What exactly though? I'm not sure we would want to put a whole lot. I wouldn't want to put a whole lot of more definition around that based on where we are in the text today.
Well, think about what the commands are after this, because there's a list of commands after this that should give us that should give us a clue as to what they're actually confessing here. The list of commands after that confession, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And then he goes on, these words that I command you today shall be on your lips. And then he talks about teaching them to their children. So the point is the utter exclusivity of Yahweh. Exclusivity of Yahweh is the only God.
Or primacy, right? Like we could say exclusivity, or maybe we should lean. And so maybe the fifth definition, he's first. So exclusivity, primacy.
Right. So
I don't want to automatically rule any of those out.
He stands in first place in their affections, in their actions, in their loyalties, in their loves. He stands in first place with regard to all those things. Why? Well, because he's the only God. He's the creator of the heavens and the earth, and because he's the God who's bound himself in covenant with them. Not only is he the only God, but he is their only God. And I think that's the reason for the commands that flow after this. And I'm in
complete agreement. And what I think both you and I want to defend against is somebody taking this word one here and arguing against a Trinitarian understanding of the personhoods of God once we get into the New Testament. And I don't know, my only point is, I don't know that the nature of God being one person versus three persons, the God, I don't know that that's the argument being made at all from this text.
I think that it's at least implied, and part of that's because of how this gets reappropriated later on. This Shema, this confession, there's nothing. Even if you do recognize that this is a statement about God's nature, like even if you do recognize that, there's nothing within that recognition that demands Unitarianism, because the recognition would be that when you speak of the Lord your God, you're speaking about the divine essence. He is one. Yes, he is, but three in person, so there's, even if you did recognize that this is a statement about the divine nature, it's not a necessary inference to get to Unitarianism from there. And I know you don't think it is either. But.
No, I don't, so I'm trying to close the door to that with my understanding.
Yeah, this verse certainly, all of us have our minds swirling with what we know is coming later. And you both have brought in the Trinitarian nature of the conversation. I would have, if I answered this question first, I would have answered very similarly to you that you did, Micah, about I think this is being a strong contrast with polytheism, particularly, as they're going in, and the peoples that they're supposed to be driving out of this land and the cultures that are around them. They are not to be polytheistic. They are not to add to their pantheon. Their God is one. And I think that even closes the door, Greg, to the definition that you're at least leaving open as a possibility. You're certainly right in the semantic range, it's possible. But, there's a term that you guys are, I'm sure, familiar with, probably many of our watchers are as well, but it's a less familiar term. We all know monotheism and polytheism, but then there's henotheism, which also admits that there are other deities, but that, for maybe one group, like this is our primary God, there are other gods, but it's kind of a cultic type of view. Or like with the Roman pantheon, Zeus could be like the head of that, like he's the god of gods. And there are some who think, of course, that Yahweh is just this cultic regional deity, and that a command like this isn't saying that other gods don't exist, but that he is just for them their one God, and that they are not to give their devotion to other gods of the land. But of course, we have to go to other scriptures that will seem to indicate that no, this exclusivity isn't simply because of this cultic deity, but that he is actually the only God. But another thing just to consider. Now, a verse we've looked at before, Genesis 2:24, when it talks about, for this reason, a man shall leave father and mother and shall cleave to his wife. They will become one flesh. It's the same word. It's the same Hebrew word, ehad. And so you have two persons, a man and a woman, cleaving together to become one. And what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that they, morph into some sort of, new being, a new entity, or is it speaking of a unity that now, two households that were once separate now are coming together in a unified singular whole, that what is one is not the personhoods, right? The man and the woman don't cease to be individual persons, but now they have a joint, unified purpose. And certainly if you've ever read any if you haven't, I can't recommend it necessarily, but some of these other like ancient Canaanite religions that sometimes people go, Yahwism was just exactly like all these other Canaanite religions. Those gods are never united in purpose. They're conniving, and they're backstabbing, and they're just silly, and they're contrary to each other, and so. This statement here in Deuteronomy 6, I do think this is an exclusive monotheistic declaration. And however, for those who would want to try and use this passage to say that Trinitarianism, if it were to develop later from other passages, which of course we all believe that it will, but we'll have to wait till we get there. We've done an episode on Trinitarianism before, so if people can't wait till we get to the New Testament, they could go click on this other video that we've done. The range that you've given, Greg, I think does leave open that this isn't as decisive against Trinitarianism as the Unitarians would think.
Not only that, but the word God here is plural, not singular, if I remember right. Now, I don't see that as being a problem. I don't think it's polytheistic either. I think that lends support to a Trinitarian understanding. Now, I will say this. I know some viewers may be thinking right now, well, you can't, draw a conclusion just from that one thing alone. I totally agree. As Scripture goes on, we'll see that this concept is more fully developed. When you get to the New Testament, it's very developed. But I think at least it's a crumb that is, I think, meant to lead us in a certain direction.
Clearly, this group of people at this point is supposed to be worshiping Yahweh and Yahweh alone. That we can all agree on. If we are going to come to a Trinitarian nature or understanding of who this God of the Bible is, we all agree it's not this verse that's going to do it. And I will just state from my position, this verse can't undo it either. Like, this isn't saying that a Trinitarian nature is polytheism, because it isn't. And many people who don't understand Trinitarianism love to expose that they know nothing about Trinitarianism by saying, oh, you Trinitarians are polytheists. No, we're not. And one of the reasons that we're not is because we also agree with Deuteronomy 6:4 that the Lord our God is one. And so no, we're not polytheists. But you can say it as much as you want to. Doesn't make it true. So
you
anyway,
could repeat that.
Yeah, you could keep saying it. All it means is that you don't really understand what you're critiquing, and that's fine. I know I've done that of other positions. It's hard to understand positions you don't hold. The Trinitarian doctrine is. It's not built from this passage alone, and this passage can't undo it. And again, the reason I'll just state, we see other verses like the two will become one flesh. The personhoods of the man and the woman don't cease to exist in whatever this new ehad is. And so the persons of God, if there are multiple persons of God, do not make him multiple deities. And the purpose is, of course, if we should see that, I'll use the terms that you use, Micah, so that I'm not running ahead, but I'm only looking back. God, his word, and his spirit, if those are actually separate personages within the being that we call God, we can have zero doubt from a passage like this that their purposes are completely unified, that they are not in contrary ways to each other. They're not doing like what Zeus and Thor are doing, of trying to go behind each other's backs and fight with each other or something like that. They are completely unified in their purposes.
in that unified purpose points to a greater unity too. I think that's necessary to I know you believe that, but it's necessary to clarify that, because theoretically me and my wife could be totally united in purpose, but we are separate beings.
Yes.
We are separate persons and separate beings. But the unity of purpose between God's word, God, his word, and his spirit points to a higher degree of unity where they equally is not the right word, because hard to use adequate terminology for this. They each subsist in the divine nature. So it's a unity of purpose, but that unity of purpose and oneness of action points to a greater unity of essence.
I'm in full agreement with that. My statement is simply saying that if it can mean me and my wife are one in some way, it certainly is not so strict as to say that those who would use this as a proof text against Trinitarianism, that this must mean one being and one being alone, because it doesn't mean that in my marriage. And so, these ranges of meanings help us to realize that this particular word that's used in Deuteronomy 6:4 isn't as exclusive as the Unitarians would claim that it must be. In fact, it's broader than I would even want it to be used here. I am not a henotheist, and I do not believe in polytheism. And so this is arguing for a meaning that is well within the middle, not on any of the extremes of the semantic range of the Hebrew word that's used in Deuteronomy 6:4. That's the argument that I'm making.
And I need to criticize the ESV Study Bible here, because even as I was doing I know everyone thinks that I'm all about the ESV because it's the extra sovereign version, but
you are the King James only folks. You're like the ESV only folks, right?
Yes, yes.
that is an unfair stereotype, and
anything else is less inspired. So the ESV Study Bible, though, said it does not. The authors of the study notes are not promoting henotheism, or what some people call practical monotheism, but they do say that the purpose of this passage is not necessarily to teach this monotheistic view of God. It's to rather a practical point that this is the God who's covenanted himself to you, therefore you're to worship and serve him alone. I think that really underestimates what's being said here, because of even what the name Yahweh means. He is the only self-existing one. So his covenant name, by which he's bound himself to covenant to his people, is also a reflection of who he is from eternity. It's like this God, this self-existing one, this I am, the only one that exists in this category, has joined himself to you. That's why you're to only serve him. This twofold purpose. He's the only God, self-existing one, and he's yours. I think you have to go to monotheism in this text, I think.
Yeah, I agree. None of us would think anything differently than that. And so I am curious to hear what you guys would think. Micah, you already kind of opened the door a little bit, but I'd like to run down this other trail. What follows this command, there's this declaration that the Lord is one. Then there's this command that they should love him with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. But then about teaching it to their children. We looked at this back in our last episode in chapter 4, that there's this responsibility to teach it to your sons and to your grandsons. Do you see any import in this? Do you see this as more of a continuation of what we saw in chapter 4, and going back even to what God said to Abram all those years ago, that God was going to fulfill his plan, not only of blessing his household, but the whole earth, by him teaching his household after him?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. Israel, we know Israel was inclined to forget God and his law. If we look back at Deuteronomy 4:9, we can, we don't got to look back at any one passage. The whole, everything we've read so far, there's so many examples of God trying to get Israel to obey him, and Israel is just constantly rebelling and going astray. And the remedy for this was to constantly expose themselves to the law by always having it in front of them in one way or another, and talking about it with their families and their neighbors. I think repetition was just so valuable in keeping it in their hearts. And the same is true for us today. We need to constantly keep God's word in front of us. We need to constantly read it. We need to constantly think about it. This helps us to to keep God number one, and to help us be obedient to him. I also want to point out that it's implied in verses 4-9 that a person can't love God without being intimately acquainted with his word, because God is revealed in his word. Apart from God's word, you really can't know God, at least not and not the way that he intends for you to know. So I just want to offer that for your consideration.
Well, and this points to a natural principle. You will pass on to your kids what you love. I mean, the command is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart, and then you shall diligently teach them to your children. Even secular literature about secular things bears out this principle that the things that Dad, is most passionate about, and the things that bring him joy and satisfaction, the things that give his life meaning and purpose, are the things that, like, most of the time those get passed on to the kids. So, like, a really obvious example of this is sports. Most kids follow the same sports team as their father. Now, there's outliers, okay? But like, if the dad is really, really into sports, like, this is what he's into. Like, we're watching football in our house. Like, 99% of the time, that gets passed on to the kids. What if Dad was really excited about the things of God? What if he actually loved the Lord with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength? What if that's what dominated his thoughts? Do you think that might, like, that's God's normal way of saving his people? That's his regular standard operating procedure about drawing his people to himself, is by having moms and dads that actually love the Lord with all their heart, so much so that the things that God has commanded them are on their lips. And even if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4, the command is a little bit different. It says, take care, keep your soul diligently, verse 9, lest you forget all the things that your eyes have seen, lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children. So now it's not just what God has commanded, but it's what he's done. So it's what God has done to save them, to deliver them from Egypt. It's what he's commanded them, the ways in which they're to walk. These are the things that are supposed to dominate their hearts and dominate their speech, their patterns of life with their children. You cannot separate how you actually live day to day in the home from loving the Lord with all your heart. How you live in the home will show what you love.
Yeah, I mean, Micah stole exactly what I was going to say, even down to the example of football or sports. I was going to use the same exact example. What you are passionate about will bleed out. There's a quote, it's semi-connected, something like, whatever comes out of you when you're hit proves what you're made of. Whatever squishes out proves what you're made of. And so your life, as you go through life, if what is coming out of you is God's word, man, that's what's inside of you. If what's coming out of you is wickedness and darkness and evilness, guess what's inside of you. And so it is the most natural product of a man or woman who loves God is the expression of that, and who most naturally to pass that on to than your children. We have friends who, they come over every week and we sit and we eat, and there are things that we've talked about 1,000 times. Like I'm like, wow, I'm beating this drum again. Why? Because that's what I'm passionate about. And when you sit down and listen to me, I'm eventually going to work my way to one of these, half dozen topics, because this is what I'm passionate about, and I just can't help it. That's what's inside of me and what comes out when I'm hit. So
what we just learned is that Greg abuses his guests with his hobby horses.
Yeah. Don't we all? Listen, I've been in Joe's house. I know that's true for Joe.
When you're at my house, you're usually the one asking questions. I'm just trying to follow your lead. So you bring your same pattern at your house to my house. But that's all right. I'm happy to invite you over again.
All right. Well, let me move us on. Verses 8 and 9, you shall bind them as a sign of your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. This is the second instance where we've seen something as a sign on the hand and on the forehead. Exodus 13 being the other example where the Feast of Unleavened Bread is to be the same thing, a sign on the hand and the forehead. And as we were studying that passage, we said that that's supposed to be understood metaphorically. And so because I anticipate future signs being on hands and foreheads, is this supposed to be taken literally, or is this some metaphorical image that is supposed to communicate something else?
So I lean toward the idea that this is to be understood metaphorically. And the reason I say that is because earlier in verse 6, God told them that his words should be on their heart. And I think binding them on their hands and foreheads was a way of saying the same thing. It just means you're to keep these things close to you. You're to treasure these things. You're to think about these things often. Now, some Israelites seem to have taken the expression literally, and they did wear pieces of parchment on their bodies with portions of the law written on them. Some of them did take it literally. I think they probably misunderstood the command, because you can have the text fastened on your body somewhere and still not be thinking about it. I don't know. I tend to think that it's metaphorical.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to just distill what's being communicated down here into two words, I would say authority and identity are probably what's being symbolized here. If you put something on your forehead and on your right hand, or it just says hand, but it's like it seems that what's being communicated is a sign of ownership. We just baptized somebody yesterday, and as we did that, I declared, I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Well, what is that? Well, that's a recognition, or you could say it's sort of like a writing or a stamp of authority and identity on the person that's being baptized. This person is entering into the visible covenant community, is proclaiming that Jesus is Lord, and is having the name of the triune God publicly placed upon them, being publicly identified with him. So I think that's pretty much what's going on here. I think that later, and I'm pretty sure that the Jews that actually did start taking this literally, it was much later in the rabbinic tradition. And I mean, we know like all the twisted ways that some of that stuff came about. I think that it's most likely metaphorical or symbolic, and it's to say, no, like, you're a people that belong to Yahweh. He is your covenant God. That's why you do all these things. That's why you're supposed to have this on your heart. His authority is on you, and you belong to him. That's your identity.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. Do you have any evidence of that, like when it developed? Because I know that like we have sources that have a name for these boxes. The Greek name is phylacteries. The Hebrew name, I think, is tefillin, or I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But just because we read later the names of these things doesn't necessarily mean that that was the development of the tradition. I guess my understanding is that those names were telling us that this was practiced for a long time, and then like the literal way of understanding this that they had. We've read other things, back in Numbers, they had cords of blue that they were supposed to wear to remind them to follow the Lord and not follow their heart. That these literal symbols were something that they were supposed to wear. And of course, Eric, as you said, just because you do that, does that guarantee that you'll obey it? Well, no, of course not. Hypocrisy is possible, no matter what. But are you perhaps more likely to remember this thing if every single day you actually have to wear them on your person? Sure. And so we've seen things that were no doubt literal before, like the cords. Those weren't metaphorical cords, or just have cords in your heart, that remind you that these were literal physical cords that they were supposed to wear. And for those who took this literally, I'm not aware of any evidence that the practice developed later. I know that like we get the name for it later, but if you're aware,
I thought I had read that somewhere.
Okay, I'm all ears if you got it. If not, I just was. If you had it on the tip of your tongue, I'd be interested in that information.
I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but I know that there's a very modern Jewish practice that for some like extreme Orthodox Jews, they literally have a little box with the Torah that has like a small, very small.
Yeah.
My understanding
it's got 4 specific passages in it.
Yeah, so it's bound like to their forehead. That doesn't. I think that's even if you're not taking the rabbinic tradition into account, it just doesn't seem to me that that's what is being commanded here. And then later on, there are other passages later on that I think would seem to indicate more of a symbolic understanding of this too, because of names written on foreheads and hands. But
Sure. Well, we'll get to that when we get there, and I'm sure that's why, at least in part, why Greg's asking the question is to prepare for those later conversations. I think that as we've talked before, there is, at least in my mind, and I think in your guys' mind as well, a relationship between both sign and symbol. And so the symbolic meaning, why your forehead, why your hand? Well, it is probably, indicating something about your thoughts and your actions, or, authority and I can't remember the two terms you just said, but what it symbolizes, sure, but does that also then negate that there could be a literal sign? Well, to me, it doesn't. And the later rabbinic tradition, we can keep our eyes out, say in Jesus' day, as he's there, does he rebuke them for literally wearing these things, or does he rebuke them for hypocrisy, for not abiding by, you put this on your head, but you don't actually think about God's word. You put this on your hand, but you don't actually do according to what he said. These are things that we can identify. And then, when we get to later passages, say in, theoretically, maybe Revelation, does the symbolism of this necessitate that it's a non-literal, or could there be both a literal and a symbolic understanding of these things? I don't want to rule those out. My understanding of this is that it was both literal and symbolic, that it symbolized something, but that there was a literal sign, and that later rabbinic tradition captured the both, or at least it was supposed to. But like I said, if you have information that would help me to realize that they didn't start doing this, and then it was some later thing, I'd be very interested in that information if you've got it.
So, and take this with a huge grain of salt, okay?
Fair enough.
As usual.
This is, I was curious too, because it was one of those things that I had in my mind, and I knew this has been something that I'd learned somewhere. I typed into ChatGPT just now. ChatGPT, so not a scholarly source, says...
Not yet. It will be soon, though.
Wikipedia, whatever.
Physically binding God's law to the head, wearing a tefillin or phylacteries, emerges in the early Second Temple period, but the full rabbinic halakhic practice develops in the late Second Temple area and crystallizes in the early rabbinic period, 1st to 2nd century BC. So that's what it says.
Yeah, for me, the idea that these could be both literal and symbolic, I'm great with that. I think I'm doing the same thing when I have a couple of pieces of art, for I guess probably not art, but hanging on my living room walls that have scripture on it, and you can go, oh well, that's kind of just cheesy, and but no, they are things that I look to, and they are often reminders as my kids are crazily destroying my house. The idea that children are, I'm only quoting it because it's the sign on my wall, not trying to break the rules, but that children are a blessing from the Lord. Like, that helps me in that moment where I'm like, why did God give me so many kids? And so those arrows hanging on my wall that remind me, like, no, they're a good thing. And
Greg's thinking, why am I so blessed?
So I wish you'd stop blessing me, God.
Yeah.
Hold the blessings back a little bit.
Yeah. And so the idea that it would be written on your forehead and it's so small you can't read it, I think, well, that's probably not worth the time and effort you've gone to do it. But used in a proper way, I'm great with both the literal and the symbolic, not with the principle being the thrust, whether you do the practical or not.
Yeah, so I have a final question for Deuteronomy 6. What are your thoughts on the warning in verses 10 through 15? And more specifically, does this mean that it was possible for Israel to be completely destroyed as a nation? And I have a question, a very similar question for chapter 7. So what are you guys' thoughts on this?
No, because oftentimes some people look at the word destroyed and they think cease to exist. And that's actually one of the arguments that people use for an annihilationist view of hell. They'll read about the Old Testament promises of destruction, and they'll say, well, that must mean cease to exist. Well, God's going to drive out these nations and that the Israelites are inhabiting and in some sense destroy them. Does that mean that as people groups, all of these peoples cease to exist entirely? Well, no, not really. And the same thing I think could be said of Israel. They could be destroyed. They could be destroyed in the sense that root and branch are taken away from them. They're carried off to somewhere where maybe they will get sent into exile. I caught myself.
Not really, though.
Maybe they'll get sent into exile. Maybe their land will be given to someone else for a time. Like, they could be destroyed in one sense while continuing to exist as a people. So I think that if you want to make the argument that, well, this implies that they could like cease to exist entirely, I think that that's going to cause other problems for you. I don't think that destroy always brings that connotation with it.
And we've seen this language already, right? Like God said he would destroy the nation and start over from Moses. And so having just that one line there, he could have destroyed everyone, even if you want to take that in the annihilationist view, which I don't. Just having Moses, he could have still fulfilled the promise he made to Abraham if only one was left.
Yeah, so we can see how this will be fulfilled as we go forward. Hopefully, theoretically, if we had no knowledge of what comes on after this, maybe they'll go in and they'll be completely obedient, and this threat would not need to be fulfilled. But hypothetically, should this threat be fulfilled, we can see what God actually does. But similar to what he did to, we have good historical precedent of what he said, I'm going to bring you into the land, and then they didn't take that, and he said, okay, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to raise up a new generation. If he's giving this threat to them, like, if you worship these other gods, I will wipe you off the face of the earth. That doesn't necessarily also include saying, I will not keep my promise that I made to have other descendants in. And so, even if, Greg, what you just said, if I eliminate everybody but one, I can still now make of this one a nation. I could, if I theoretically had one who didn't bow the knee to these other gods, I could wipe all of you unfaithful ones off the face of the earth, and I could still fulfill my promise through this one who was faithful. Again, to read it beyond that is requiring some sort of, like annihilation that the language doesn't demand that type of an explanation. And we'll see what happens. Does he ever, should they be unfaithful, does he annihilate them? From our time in history, forget what the scriptures say. It doesn't seem like he's annihilated them because, there are still some people here that are from this lineage. So they were not annihilated and ceasing to be completely, regardless of what you may think about this.
Let me take it a step further. Not only does the word destroy not demand a interpretation where no one is left, but even the expression utterly destroyed doesn't mean that. And let me give you an example. This is Deuteronomy 4, verses 26 and 27. He says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you are going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. Notice in verse 27, what does that mean? The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord drives you. Even the words utterly destroyed don't mean no survivors.
I thought you were making the most excellent transition ever into your next question in chapter 7. I was like,
that's
wow,
exactly what I just did.
That is so impressive. I stand amazed.
Once in a while, I hit a home run, and this is one of those times.
This is one of those times.
For instance, Eric.
So anyway, that leads me to an outstanding question that's related
it would have been
to
so
this.
Smooth if Greg didn't ruin it.
I'm sorry. Were you really going there?
Yes, I was.
I stole all your thunder. I'm sorry.
Well, I don't need it. I'm too humble to even require it.
Most humble man in the universe right there.
So anyway, in Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 through 6, God, and this is one of those sections, one of those chapters that it's a stumbling block for a lot of people because they read this and they go, oh my goodness, how could God order the annihilation of entire nations? So in Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 through 6, God ordered Israel to utterly destroy the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. However, at other times, he expressed his intention to only drive out the Canaanites. There are more commands in the law to drive the Canaanites out than to destroy them. So my question is this a contradiction, or can the language be harmonized? And I partially answered that question already, although there are other ways of looking at it. So any additional thoughts?
You have to really ask yourself, what does it mean to destroy? Because we bring all sorts of connotations into that aren't necessarily the biblical picture of destruction. So, and we do the same thing when the Bible promises death. We take our materialistic framework and we say death means that you cease to exist. No, it just doesn't mean that in the Bible. Just like, so when God says he's going to destroy the wicked, it doesn't mean the wicked cease to exist. When he says he's going to destroy certain nations, well, like, it does not mean cease to exist. It means, like, well, are they going to cease to, like, be nations in a certain sense? Are they going to be dispossessed of this land? Are they going to have all support and supply taken away from them? Is their monarchy going to be cast down and overthrown? And, like, yeah, but all of those things are certain types of destruction, but none of which necessarily imply a cessation of existence.
I find that argument really interesting. I want you to hold on to that as a general, as you swim in the Calvinistic pool. When we get to Ephesians chapter 2, I think that argument is going to, I think that we're going to create very interesting conversation, I would imagine.
Let me get the conversation back on the rails.
That's not a demerit, by the way.
But I think this is really important that we understand the language of Scripture, because first of all, the language at times is very nuanced. Like Micah already said, we understand destroy a certain way. The Bible does not necessarily understand it the same way. When we're talking, we'll read about what we've already read about Israel's utter destruction. We've read about, and we're going to continue to read about the utter destruction of the Canaanites. We need to realize that this language is, I think, meant to be taken in a very specific way. In Deuteronomy 4, utter destruction simply means that the nation is utterly overthrown. They're not a nation the way that they were before. They've been dispossessed of land. They're scattered among the nations. Utterly destroyed does not mean leave no survivors. And we'll see time and time again where this language is used, and it just simply cannot be taken literally. If you take it literally, you're going to run into all sorts of problems and contradictions.
Yeah, I agree with everything with the minor push. I do think he means it literally, but not with, as Mike was saying, the materialistic way of saying that we have to take some worldly definition. This is not some like, well, symbolically you'll be destroyed, but you'll still be in the land and everything will be fine. This is a serious punishment,
right?
For sure.
Our literal interpretation is what I'm talking
we don't
about.
need some hard line stance of saying that this means the cessation of your existence, because it's just not required. And the destruction that comes can be a literal destruction without being the cessation of them as a nation. And that leads into my next question. In this same context, verses 7 through 11, specifically verses 7 through 8, God gives his reason for why he's choosing them, what his purpose is in choosing them. And I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are about this. And then I also have a follow-up question about his choice of them. But any thoughts that you have of, God is explicitly saying, I've chosen you for a purpose. This is what I'm doing. And even related to the conversation before, like if they don't worship him, he'll destroy them, in the sense that we were just talking about. Any thoughts that you have about this? Because, people get all sorts of confused, I think, about why God chose this people for this purpose.
Yeah, I think that this actually does point to the unconditional nature of the certain promises within the Abrahamic covenant, because he's not even talking about his choosing of, like, the choosing here is not extending back to like his choice of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. It implies that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have already been chosen, that the promised line has indeed been promised, and therefore he chooses them as a nation now and setting his love on them, bringing them up out of the land of Egypt to bring them into this land to possess. It's something that's more in the immediate context, but it implies something that goes back to our conversation about whether the promises to Abraham were conditional or unconditional. I think that he sets his love on them for a number of reasons, one of which is because he promised this thing to Abraham, and he's going to fulfill that.
Yeah, I agree. Let me say just one very, very briefly, one thing about the conditional nature of God's promise to Abraham. I talked about this a while ago. My position is that God's promises to Abraham were conditional up to a certain point and then became unconditional because of Abraham's faithfulness in Genesis chapter 21. So, 21, I think it is, or 22. Anyway, so I'll set that aside for now. But it's clear from this text that God's love and his devotion for Israel, it was based on an oath that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says that. He promised this to them. He promised to bless their descendants and make them into a great nation, and more specifically, a nation in the land of Canaan. And so his devotion to Israel was, it wasn't based on external things. It wasn't based on how many people they had. He says, I didn't choose you because you were the most numerous people, but actually you're like the fewest. So I am committing myself to you. I'm being faithful to you because of promises that I made in the past. I intend to keep those promises. I'm not going to break them. And so God is basing his faithfulness on the promises that he made to the patriarchs.
Yeah, I think I'm agreeing for the most part with everything you guys have said. I think if I were to reword this, I would say, God is saying, I love you because I love you and because I promised to love you. I promised to do this, and I'm doing it because I do. I love you because I do, and I promise to do it, and therefore this is me loving you.
Well, I'll say amen to all that. And I mean, your answers have led very naturally to this follow-up question. Do we have any reason, as we've been reading through from Genesis till now, we've seen temporally that God chose Noah, for example, to be the means by which he was going to preserve the human race. We saw him choose Abram. We saw him choose Isaac. We saw him choose Jacob over Esau. And we've seen this selection. And even as you guys are describing, you're going back to some of these previous choices, and Micah, as you're saying, but it's not even necessarily about that. It implies that, but now he's choosing them. He's setting his love on them because he loves them, not because they've earned it, not because they deserved it. Setting aside the conditional versus unconditional nature of it, do we have anything that we've read that has indicated that he chose them before the world began? Because all of those things that we can look at, they all seem to be a choosing in time. I chose them, I chose him, I chose this one, I chose this one, I chose this one, now I'm choosing you. Is there any reason, aside from, of course, we have there's potentially systematic reasons, but is there any reason of anything that we've read in the text that would give us any idea other than God is temporally choosing in what we would call, time, to this temporal choice? Is there any reason to indicate something that this was some eternal choice that happened before the world began?
No, I have no textual reason to make that argument.
I wouldn't say there's a textual reason from this text to assume that, no.
Well, just what we've read so far, we can't draw that conclusion from anything we read so far. Now, we can say, remember that it's in Genesis, I think it's 25, where God chose Jacob over Esau, I think it was. And that was, he made a choice before either one of them was born. But choosing them before the foundation of the world is a completely different matter that goes beyond the text. So we can say that God made a choice beforehand, but it doesn't go back that far.
While they were in the womb, though.
Yeah,
while they were in the womb.
Not before they existed, but before they...
But you could take the specific examples like that and say this reflects some sort of eternal purpose. But like if we're just sticking to the textual boundaries that we have so far, no, I think that there's a lot that has not been fleshed out entirely yet.
Yep, and I appreciate that. And again, if there are texts that would cause us to rethink this, as we're going, I'm trying to document that to me, at least as we're reading this, there seems to be a weight building that this selection isn't about anything that they did, which that speaks to that unconditional nature of it. Primarily, he's choosing them. Greg, I thought you said it very concisely. He's loving them because he loves them. That's why he's done that. He does have a greater purpose, which goes beyond that. But even as we see these threats, his purpose is beyond simply just loving them and blessing them as a group. Like he has a bigger purpose, which does tie back to what he said to Abram, that through you, all the families of earth will be blessed. And so there is a temporal nature to this that I at least wanted to document, but I don't have anything further, so we can move on unless you guys have further thoughts about it.
No. All right. So verses 25 and 26, this isn't the first time we've seen this, but they are commanded to burn with fire all of their images, completely eradicate anything that would potentially cause them distraction or turning away from God. And so I'm not trying to equate us with Israel in any way, but Does this have anything to say to us as we live in a day and a time and a place where pagan altars, demonic altars are being erected in our land? Like, not saying we should go and burn those down or tear those down, but this, I don't know. What do you take away from this text as you relate it to our current condition in America in 2025, almost 2026?
So those nations that Israel was driving out and dispossessing also were not Israel in that special covenantal relationship with God. And yet one of the reasons they get dispossessed from their lands is because of these images that Israel is then told to burn down and to completely destroy, and leave no vestige of. I think that does speak to God's judgment on the nations for their idolatry and the responsibility of nations that are not Israel to not allow public idolatry. Now, I also believe in the inability of the government to compel anyone's conscience with regard to public worship. So I don't want the government involved in like religion, determining what's orthodoxy, formally establishing a official religion or official state church or anything like that. I wouldn't go that far, but I don't think that disestablishmentarianism means you have to allow every form of public idolatry in your streets. I don't think you have to have you will have to allow parades to the Hindu gods in your streets. I think you can say that causes disorder, it's idolatrous, it causes dysfunction, it's not part of our American heritage, we're just not going to allow it. I think that there are all sorts of arguments that you could make, even if you weren't going to try to make first table of the law arguments. Even if you weren't going to try to make those arguments, you can make second table arguments as to why you shouldn't allow these sorts of gross public idolatry. For instance, every society that Islam comes into, it wreaks havoc on that society and causes societal disorder and disruption and chaos. You see that in Europe right now, which is basically becoming an Islamic continent almost. You see it in parts of our state right now. I don't think you have to allow public idolatry, even under our own constitutional system. But I definitely think that there was an expectation that these nations would not make idols. This is one of the reasons they're being judged, and it's one of the reasons we're being judged.
Yeah, well, I've said this many, many times before, so Mike, I can sympathize with your sentiments. I think I believe God holds all nations to a standard of righteousness, not all necessarily equally. I think Israel was held to a greater standard of righteousness than the other nations because they had the law. But as I was thinking about this, I thought, why is, and this is, I guess, more of a follow-up question, why was God so focused on getting the idolatry out of the land of Canaan as opposed to getting it out of some other nation? Why not out of Babylon? Why not out of Assyria? Why not out of, I realize these nations aren't, developed at this time, at least not the way that they're going to be. But why eliminate Canaanite idolatry specifically? Why focus on that region as opposed to another region? Like I don't really know how to answer that. Maybe there's an excellent, or maybe even a simple reason. I don't know exactly what that is. Now you could say, well, God promised to give it to Abraham. Okay, fair enough. But why did he promise to give that land to Abraham and not another? So these questions are swirling in my mind.
Yeah, I don't really have a question to that question, or I don't have an answer really to that question, Eric. I could speculate, and it just seems like, well, God has to start somewhere, so this is what he's doing. And his desire is that his name would be worshipped and glorified in all the earth, and since it's not, he's picking someone and he's starting somewhere, and this is what he chose. But maybe someone could disagree with that. But Greg, to get back to your question, I'm firmly on the record. I haven't changed my position that I am not a Christian nationalist. I do not think that this, command, follows to us. I do not think it's our task, in the new covenant to be rooting out idolatry in the same way that they were here. And I think it's probably, I personally would need a very direct New Testament command that if we were supposed to do something today similar to this, I would need instruction in the New Testament. They're doing a lot of things, going in, killing men, women, and children. Well, I don't think we're supposed to do that part. Should we burn down I don't think we should do that part. There's a lot that they're doing that I don't think applies directly to us. That was a direct command to them. And so, I just, for my part, I would have a very difficult time selectively choosing some of these elements that need to be applied to us directly or giving us permission to do things. And then who gets to decide? We all would agree that some sort of statue of like Baphomet or something like that is clearly something that's bad. But what about those who say that Christmas trees are pagan idols? Like, do you want to give them authority to go in and chop those things down and throw them out as well? Probably not. So there's some limits, and there would be even some disagreement on people within this call as to where those lines are drawn. And so this command to them doesn't directly apply to us, in my opinion. It doesn't sound like any of you think it directly applies to us. Micah, your arguments were from other things, and I would need to see a New Testament command, for me to get on board with that. Even if our government allowed it, if the New Testament didn't say that we should do that, I don't know that we should go, to that. Yeah. Position, personally,
I'm not saying that the church, as the church, goes and cuts down people's statues and stuff like that. I don't think that's the New Testament church's function. I guess the question I'm asking more of is, did the governments of these nations, whatever form they took, have a responsibility to not allow gross forms of public idolatry in public spaces? I think yes. And I think that
I agree with that, actually.
Yeah. And I think that nations now, probably as governments, not as the new covenant people of God, not as the church, no, magistrates in their God-ordained function, do they have a responsibility to outlaw gross forms of public idolatry? I'm not saying you're raiding people's houses to see if they're bowing down to idols. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, what parades are you going to allow in your streets? What goes? What kind of regulations are you going to put on these things? I do think that nations probably have a responsibility with regard to that, but not the new covenant people of God as the church.
I think God has always expected all nations to, again, maintain a certain level of righteousness. God is driving out the Canaanites for their idolatry. God flooded the whole earth because, of course, it doesn't speak explicitly of idolatry there, but because of their evil, because the evil was left unchecked, because it was allowed to run rampant. I think the governments have the responsibility of dealing with these types of things and bringing about some level of justice. Again, they didn't have the law of God, so they couldn't be expected to carry out justice in the exact same way that Israel could, knowing the law, but they were held to a certain standard.
What say you, Greg?
What say I?
Is your question? I want to know.
Yeah, no, I don't often like to answer my own questions. I think that at the very least, this ought to serve as a cautionary warning for us today. We live in a land that has convinced itself that all religions are equal. Yet, as I read this, it seems like a people, a land, is polluted by the worship of false gods. And so instead of wanting to take a militant form of Christian nationalism that says, hey, as a church, we ought to go and burn down mosques, I'm not arguing for that. But I think it ought to drive us with a passion to go out and share the gospel so that we can protect our nation, protect our people, protect our families against whatever judgment may come if we sit back and we go, well, separation of church and state, separation of whatever. If we are complacent about the erection of idols and the worship of demon gods in our land, I think that's going to have consequences, if not for me, for my kids or my grandkids. And so I don't want to tolerate that, because I think it is a better thing to live in a nation that manifestly bows a knee to Christ rather than to whatever demon god it does. And so I think this ought to motivate me to go out and Christianize everybody I can, because it will have, I think, consequences if we don't.
I'm in most agreement with that, but I don't know that you mean it with this technical nuance, but I'm more for evangelizing than I am for Christianizing. I think evangelizing means you could, if these types of things are going, you go and you proclaim the gospel and you hope that miraculously that their hearts will be changed and they'll stop this foolishness. Christianizing can take on more force, saying we're going to come stop you by force, and we're gonna tear down these things and we're going to burn these things down. I do not think, and I'm
with you.
The demerit
Yes.
for that. The New Testament says we ought to go and proclaim the gospel and evangelize, but I do not think it is our task to go and destroy and to convert by the sword or compel Christian behavior outwardly without that inward change that can only come through the proclamation of the gospel.
You and I are on the same page there, though. If some guy walks in and sees a statue of Satan set up in his local courthouse and he goes, well, not here, not today. I feel moved to just kick this thing over. I'm not going, I'm going to go, yay,
right.
you.
The government should do that.
So
the
what I
government
wanna
should
know-
destroy the
but
statue.
why? But why? But
Yeah.
you
Well,
and I are I completely agree. But the question is why? Why would they, if Christians aren't informing the government of their need to bow the knee to Christ? And so that's where the evangelism.
The two work together. Evangelism is the key. I
wouldn't have drawn
agree with
the
that.
differentiation between evangelism and Christianization. But if that's the line, I'm totally on the side of evangelization.
I'm not sure everybody would agree with that. That's how I define it.
And so I'm willing to accept your terms, and I agree with your conclusion.
I have a question.
I would even argue though, like everyone in government knows Satan worship is an awful, despicable thing.
Yet they all do, or so many of them do it.
Well, I realize that, but in an ideal world where people's conscience still work, I think.
Do you live in an ideal world?
No, no. But I'm thinking idealistically here. So anyway, Micah, go ahead with your question.
I guess I have a question for Joe about where because if you take this, like this government has no responsibility to restrain what is allowed worship wise in the public square. Like if you take that, and I don't know that you necessarily do, but
I don't.
Okay, so like where are the breaks then? So like is the station should the government allow the Satan statue in the Iowa House of Representatives, or do they have some authority under God to say nope, we're not doing that here?
Yeah, I mean, government has authority that it has. In some places, it's illegal to do what we're doing, to talk about Jesus and to believe in him. This is a punishment that's worthy of death, and they'll come, and if they knew we had a church, they'd come and burn it down. So this question is, very subjective. In our land, you're asking about Iowa, should they have the right to do that? Well, I mean, based on the freedom of religion that we have, the same thing that allows us to freely talk about our God and to worship him openly and publicly, does seem to be a right that is extended to others, at least currently. And I'm thankful for that right here, that we're not in danger of being raided and killed and burned and tortured and executed for, blasphemy like we would be if we were in Iran or something, because we're blaspheming the Prophet Muhammad and Allah, and we're saying that Jesus, is Lord. So do governments have that right? Sure. Yeah. Well, who am I to stop a government? But the question that Greg asked was, what does the church do? And so we're not having a political conversation, at least as far as I understood. We're having a religious conversation, and then the nature between how should religion and state function together. Well, we have had an episode about that, and I mean, certainly that's an interesting thing to talk about. But governments, do they have a right to do that? Yeah, they can do whatever they want as long as they can force it by the sword, and they really have the right to do it until somebody else with a bigger sword comes along and tells them to knock it off. Now we're doing something different. But no matter what the government says, we are governed by kingdom principles. Israel was, in many ways, a much more theocratic nation than America is, or other places. And so the lines between those things are fairly complicated. I'm not trying to dodge your question, but does government have that? Do I have a preference for certain things? Yeah, sure. But I do also want. I also want to be very careful, and then I'll let you make your point. Sorry about that, but I do want to be very cognizant of the fact that every time Christian nations have begun to exist, when the Christian whatever the ruling Christians are who then begin to inform the government, often it's not just pagans and devil worshippers. It's also born again Christians who are being killed and persecuted under these same types of governments. And that's when you begin to get, this is where my definition for Christianization comes in. It's where you start to invest, you Christianize the world by forcing outward conformity. And I just got to be honest, I have zero interest in that whatsoever. It's one of the biggest reasons why I'm not a Christian nationalist. Although, of course, I'd rather Christianity be preferenced in our nation. Of course, I'd rather that we didn't have parades of devil worshipers, running through our streets. But that's a personal preference. And if I want those things to stop, I would rather not trust the government. I would rather say, well, if we don't want that, we ought to go out and evangelize and trust that the Lord will change people's hearts. And they'll forsake these practices. Even if they have the right to do them, they will turn away from them because it's nonsense and foolishness. Again, I'll refrain myself there. Sorry.
And I recognize this is more of a question of statecraft and political theology than it is. I agree, the church and the state have absolutely different responsibilities. The church's responsibility is to go proclaim the gospel, win the lost, persuade people to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. Absolutely. My question is, if you did have a sort of ideal government, like a government where, let's say a government that's filled with Christians. Okay. My question is not so much what are they able to do? Yeah, they can do whatever the power of their sword allows them to do. But what has God actually commissioned them to do? And what do they have a responsibility to do before God? Do they have a responsibility before God to knock down the Satan statue in the Iowa House of Representatives? I think they do. I think that the both tables of the law govern how magistrates rule over lands. That doesn't mean I think they compel worship. I don't think they compel worship. I think that they outlaw certain forms of egregious idolatry that cause societal chaos, disruption, disorder, things like that. That would be my sort of broad example of it, or my broad explanation of where I fall.
Yeah. I think I understand your position. All I was trying to say was, are this group here, as we're reading in Deuteronomy, are they commissioned to go in and knock these things down? Oh, yes, that's what this is saying. And Greg's question was, does that mean that we ought to do the same thing today? I can't get to that position you just articulated from this passage. I would need something in the New Testament that says we are commissioned to do something similar, and that goes beyond, here. So if you're correct, I couldn't give my justification this passage here in Deuteronomy, which I don't think you would either. So again, I'd have to delay my answer to say, if you are correct, I would need to be persuaded by something other than this passage we're looking at in Deuteronomy.
If for no other reason than the people doing the destruction here aren't the government of Israel. This is the nation. This is everybody, right? Every military aged man is participating in this as opposed to the government.
Yeah. And I guess the question that I was asking is before Israel's told to do this, was there some responsibility of these Gentile governments to not allow this stuff in the first place? I think so. Directly to our situation in America, whether Gentile governments have a responsibility to outlaw certain things. But maybe that's more of a hypothetical. Maybe it's not directly tied to the purpose of the text.
I think a case can be made. It's maybe not ironclad. I think a case can be made that the commands in Genesis 9 are universal, not intended for Israel. They're intended for everybody. And it's not specifically dealing with idolatry, but it's giving government in general a sword to punish evil and to protect the righteous. And I think that however that has to play out, the government has a responsibility to enforce that.
And I think you can even take that back to the dominion mandate, right? Like the idea that we are to go out and exercise dominion in the name of the Creator God, Yahweh. I think if you needed to, you could make the case all the way back that far.
So the counter argument to what Eric just said is that Genesis 9 deals with murder, and that's a second table issue, not a first table issue dealing with the worship of the true God. So most people, most hardcore disestablishmentarians who think there's no boundaries on what the government should be able to. The government should enforce no boundaries with regard to public worship. They would say, well, this is clearly a second table issue dealing with how image bearers relate to one another, not a first table issue dealing with how image bearers relate to the one true God. So they would say, yeah, God does give the government responsibilities, but it's to enforce things like laws against murder and things like that, not laws excluding certain kinds of worship from the public square. That would be the counter argument.
Eric made a longer case before, about whether nations are still accountable to this, and we can, maybe, Eric, if you have final thoughts, we'll give you the last word on this. But the case that you made before previously, it could be argued that God is using this nation that He's choosing now to bring about judgment because they are accountable. And so then the question still that Greg initially got us down this is the church then a similar instrument that is being raised up to do that thing, or is it not? I would say the answer to that is no.
The answer is no.
I would need to see that in the New Testament very explicitly. And so, but we'll see that God is able to raise up both believing nations and unbelieving nations to be an instrument in His hand. And again, I'll take the demerit for that. But He does hold them accountable in ways that this nation is bringing about judgment for the sin. Eric's talked about, he was waiting until the sin of the Amorite reached its full measure. And now it seems that has happened. And in comes this group as an instrument partially of judgment in the hand of God. And so they are commissioned with authority from God to do this. And, does that apply to now? Even if nations will be held accountable by God for their idolatrous worship, which we all would agree that they will. Everybody will have to stand before God and give an account for what they've done. Who is it that is being raised up to bring judgment, temporal judgment, physical judgment against them? Well, that's up to God to decide. And can we just unilaterally say that Christians have some responsibility to go in and judge these things? No, we wouldn't do that with murder either, right? We can't just go out and be vigilantes because of, and we had that with like our Avenger of Blood conversation. So, Eric, if you had something else to say, I'm sorry if I jumped in on you. We'll give you the last word on this issue.
I think I've said enough.
Right. Well, Greg, very interesting question. And so that concludes our discussion on this. I have a bonus question, if you guys will indulge me, and it's actually only for Micah because he is stated as a Calvinist. So will you guys indulge a bonus question, or should we be all done?
Oh, no, I'm an indulgent kind of guy.
All right. So as I read chapter 7, just in totality, God says, you shall do this, you shall do these things, you shall drive out these inhabitants, and if you will do this, I will bless you. And it is my intention, at least it seems as God is saying this, that's what He wants. I'm taking away the threat of demerits because we all know that won't happen. They won't drive out these inhabitants all the way, and God will then eventually bring about some of the threats that He said to them. Particularly for you, Micah, because you have, you've expressed that your systematic lens, you talk about the decretive will of God. And so I'm curious how you would explain to someone who says, okay, if God's decretive will must be that these people will not do the things that God is saying they shall do, and they are acting contrary to what He's expressing, I would just be curious to your explanation of why it reads this way. And again, I'm not trying to be combative. I just am really interested to hear how you would explain that, because it seems to me as I read this that God is saying, here's what I want you to do, and He's expressing His will, and that there isn't a secret will behind that they should really do something else, which we know is what will happen, but that He is desiring, this is the thing I want you to do. And then I would say it seems that if it doesn't happen this way, that's why God would be genuinely frustrated, because it did not go according to what He wanted. But what would you say to that?
So I have a little bit of a bone to pick with the way that a certain part of that question was phrased, that they should do something else based on what His secret will is or His decretive will is. That's not how Calvinists view the relationship between God's moral will and His decretive will. You ought to do what God tells you to do and reveals from His moral will for you to do. That is the thing you ought to do because it aligns with what God has revealed to you. But at the same time, creatures live on a different plane than God does. We live in the realm of if this, then that. And it's true. It was true to them. If they would have done this, then certain things would have happened. And it was true to them that if they did not do this, then certain things would happen. That it's just not intended to speak to the eternal decree of God to all things that come to pass. So I think that the distinction between moral and decretive will, I think it's something that you kind of, have to have, or at least for me, if I'm going to make any sense of, everything that Scripture says. So I don't see that there's this big rub between what God reveals morally, like this is what you ought to do, versus, okay, here's what's actually going to happen in my decretive will. I don't think there has to be some sort of huge friction between those two things.
But isn't that kind of like saying, well, I don't. To me, it almost just seems like a lie in a way, because it's like God is, if they ought to do it, but what they ought to do is impossible because God has decreed that they do otherwise. I mean, and then God's saying, I really want you to do this. Well, I guess in what sense would he want it if he's decreed that it's impossible for them to do it and they're absolutely going to do the contrary? I guess, and we've kind of asked this question over and over again. I just can't. That for me, that's something that I just simply can't overcome because it sounds. And maybe I'm misunderstanding. I could have a flawed understanding of this.
In you're picking the bone over what Joe had said. Were you drawing a distinction between should and ought?
No,
Okay.
Should and ought mean the same thing.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I misunderstood. I thought you were.
So, Eric, and I think that most of us would probably agree that there are certain things that God has said will happen, and those include even things that are sinful. So, like the crucifixion of His Son. Even if you don't agree that He's the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world, you at least agree that He is slain from the foundation of the world, which is a long time before it actually happened.
Sure.
Did God say that was going to happen? Well, yes, it was part of His decree. He said two things. Is there a sense in which they ought not have done it? Yes, they ought not have done it. But so like that's the sort of like the ultimate case in point about.
But there's two things that are said about that.
There's something that God has said is going to happen: the crucifixion of His Son. And they still should not have done that heinously wicked thing. Like
right, but the scripture says two things about the crucifixion of Christ. It's at the same time. It says it was part of God's predetermined plan and foreknowledge. Those two things.
Yeah.
So of course, as we all know, there's a million different ways to interpret that, that phrase, but I don't think we can agree God does have a decretive will. He does have a permissive will. I guess where I'm coming from is I don't think that God's decretive will, is that how you guys say it, by the way?
Yeah.
Am I saying that right? Okay. I don't think that God's decretive will or his permissive will, I'm sorry, I'm goofing this all up. I don't think that God's permissive will is just, I'm going to allow only this one thing to happen. I see, as we've read, I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples just that we've covered so far where God says, I'll allow this, but there's other options that can play out. And so I see it as, yes, there are things that God has decreed. Those things will absolutely come to pass. There's no question about it. But then there are other things where, like, okay, A might happen, but it's also possible that B happens. And that would fall into the category of foreknowledge. Yes, God foreknows it, but His foreknowing it is not what caused it to happen.
Right,
I guess
but
if that
regarding the crucifixion, if the problem is that God has said this thing is going to happen, and if at the same time these people ought to have acted in another way, then the implication behind the question, it seems, is like, isn't that kind of dishonest? Well, go back to the crucifixion. Was this the predetermined plan of God? However you want to work out foreknowledge, it says crucifixion, predetermined plan. This was going to happen. And
foreknowledge.
No, they should not have done that. They shouldn't have done that thing. But God said someone was going to do that thing. So I don't think it's dishonest at all. I actually think that if you don't have that distinction, I don't know how you make sense of so much.
No, I think Acts 2
moving
clears
to
that
moving to that issue, and that wasn't my intention to move it so far to that, because I think that we probably have more agreement on that one. My question was specifically about this passage, that it seems that God wasn't saying my predetermined plan and my foreknowledge is that, I'm going to drive you out of this land. It seems like he's telling them, I want you to be in this land. Some of the questions I asked before, I want you to obey me so that your days will be prolonged. It seems like he wasn't saying that this is some theoretical possibility which will not come to pass because I've decreed it before. But again, I wasn't trying to turn this into us all piling on you. And so I appreciate you at least indulging my bonus question. And I wasn't trying to frame it in a way that is, unfair or something. I genuinely, that's how I think of it. But I appreciate you bringing some clarity. I'll think more about it. I do have some other follow-up questions, but I won't ask them now because we are out of time. And so I'm going to stop us here just because, again, we could get way into another issue, which I'm sure we'll talk about much, much more. So we can at least table some of those thoughts. But I appreciate your guys' discussion on these 2 chapters. If you're still watching this and you enjoyed the episode, what do you think? We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Is there things that we did not discuss that you would have? Let us know in the comments below. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree with us? We'd love to read your comments. If you enjoyed the episode, think about clicking the thumbs up button. Maybe share it with somebody else who you think might also enjoy it. If you want to make sure that you don't miss any more episodes in our Biblical Theology project, because, man, we've got a lot more Bible to go, make sure you hit that subscribe button and that you click on the notification bell so you won't miss our new episodes, which come out each week. But until we see you again, friends, get equipped, obey your King, and glorify your God.
We missed all that.